She was 34 years old and drawing her final breath in a cold hospital room, mourning a lifetime no one had ever truly noticed. Then her eyes opened again, not in heaven, but on the filthy floor of a stranger's apartment, face to face with a starving toddler who flinched the instant their eyes met. She recognized him immediately. He was the villain, the monster the whole story loved to hate, the one fate had already sentenced to ruin before he'd even learned to speak her name. So she made herself one impossible promise. Love him so fiercely the tragedy never gets the chance to right itself. But how does a broken woman raise a villain into someone worth loving? And what happens when the story itself fights back? Grab something warm to drink, because today's story follows a woman who died unloved and woke up holding a toddler everyone else had already given up on. If you've ever had to love someone twice as hard just to make up for how the world treated them, we want to hear that story in the comments. The last thing I felt before the darkness swallowed me whole wasn't pain. It was exhaustion, the kind that settles into your bones after a lifetime spent sprinting toward a finish line that keeps moving. It wasn't the tiredness of one long day or one hard year. It was 34 years of running on a treadmill that never once led anywhere. My entire life had been one long, desperate campaign to earn a single look from my parents, the look they reserved exclusively for my older brother. He was their golden child, their proof to the world that they had done something right. From the moment I was born, I was treated like an accident that had wandered into the wrong family, an extra mouth, an inconvenience, a smudge on their otherwise perfect portrait. Every ounce of warmth they possessed went to him, until there was nothing left over for me but a kind of practiced, polite indifference. Like most children raised on neglect, I decided the problem had to be me. If I just tried harder, ran faster, climbed higher, brought home better grades, surely they would finally see me. So I pushed. I outperformed my brother in every category that could be measured. I won competitions, graduated top of my class, broke records that the school still cites. None of it mattered. If my brother scraped by on a test, we celebrated with a 5-course dinner. If I graduated summa cum laude, I got a nod and a good job tossed over a shoulder already turned away. By the time I was 17, I understood the truth. The roles had been assigned before I was even born, and no accomplishment on earth was going to rewrite the casting. So I left. I changed my number, packed 2 bags, and built a life 1,000 miles from the house that never once felt like home. I built a company from nothing. I turned it into an empire. I collected the kind of wealth and influence people spend their whole lives chasing. And still, somehow, victory tasted like ash. It wasn't until I was lying in a hospital bed, watching the heart monitor draw its last uneven lines, that I understood why I had never actually left them behind. Their voices had ridden on my shoulders through every negotiation, every acquisition, every 3 a.m. spreadsheet. I had spent my entire adult life shouting backward through time, trying to make 2 people who weren't even listening admit that they'd been wrong about me. I built an empire not for myself, but against a family that had stopped looking decades ago. I died successful. I died powerful. I died completely empty. When my eyes opened again, the assault on my senses was so violent that for one disoriented moment I was certain I had woken up in hell. The air was thick with the sour reek of old alcohol, rot, and garbage left too long in summer heat. My skull throbbed in time with my pulse, and when I tried to push myself upright, my palm landed on the sticky film of a linoleum floor scattered with crushed cans, empty liquor bottles, and fast food wrappers gone soft with age. The only light in the room leaked gray and joyless through a window caked in grime. But this wasn't hell. As the fog in my head began to burn off, fragments of a life that wasn't mine started clicking into place like puzzle pieces forced together by an unfamiliar hand. I looked down at my own fingers, thin, pale, calloused in places that made no sense to me. They weren't the hands of the man who had built a corporate empire from a garage. Then the memories arrived all at once, a flood that threatened to crack my skull down the middle. I had died. And I had woken up inside a book. The exact novel I'd been reading during those last lonely weeks in the hospital, an Omegaverse romance with the kind of plot you could set your watch to. A luminous, long-suffering Omega lead named Felix, the devoted alpha who worshipped the ground he walked on, and the miserable, obsessive villain who tried to tear the two of them apart before meeting his well-deserved ruin in the final act. While every other reader online had spent their time swooning over the golden couple and hurling insults at the antagonist in the comments, I had been the one weirdo who cried for the villain. His name was Milo. Milo's villainy hadn't come from nowhere. It had been grown, deliberately, out of a childhood soaked in poison. His father, an alpha from an old money dynasty, had vanished the exact moment he learned a pregnancy existed, fleeing the country without so much as a note. Left holding the wreckage was Milo's Omega parent, a young man named Ethan. Ethan was the body I was currently occupying. Ethan had folded completely under the weight of that abandonment, and instead of directing his grief outward, he had turned it on the one person who couldn't fight back, his own son. In the novel's account, this had gone on for 13 years. 13 years of a slow, grinding campaign of psychological cruelty, screaming that the boy was a curse, a parasite, the single reason his father had run, the destroyer of every good thing Ethan might have had. Until the liquor finally finished the job, the heartbreak had started, and Ethan drank himself into an early grave. But I hadn't woken up at the end of those 13 years. I had woken up near the very beginning of them, with Milo barely 3 years old and Ethan's body still breathing. Whatever came next hadn't been written yet. Not anymore. Milo grew up broken, because how could he not? When he finally met Felix, the first person in his life to offer him even a scrap of warmth, Milo had no framework for receiving it. He didn't know how to love without suffocating the thing he loved. His affection came out twisted into possessiveness, into a raw, clawing insecurity that eventually drove Felix straight into the arms of the male lead, who then systematically dismantled what remained of Milo's life, his money, his reputation, his sanity, before walking off into a sunset the whole fandom cheered for. Sitting in the wreckage of that apartment, Ethan's memories settled into my bones one horrifying layer at a time. I saw a younger Ethan, naive and hopeful, falling hard for an alpha named Julian, heir to an old money dynasty, golden and untouchable, and as it turned out, made entirely of straw. I felt the dizzy euphoria of their college romance, and then, seconds later, the ice-cold terror of a positive test. I felt the exact moment Ethan told Julian about the baby, and watched his expression curdle from surprise into open disgust before he ended things on the spot. Ethan's father found out shortly after and threw his own son out onto the street with one suitcase and a string of names I won't repeat. Ethan had tried to reach Julian one last time, only to discover the number disconnected and the man himself already boarding a plane for an overseas university, wiping his hands clean of the entire situation before the ink on the pregnancy test had even dried. Dropped out of school alone and 8 months pregnant, Ethan fought a battle he was never equipped to win. He worked what jobs would have him, but once the baby came, the trap sprang shut completely. No money for daycare, no safety net, and a string of employers who tired quickly of a crying infant in the back room. The ones who kept him on paid too little to cover rent. He survived on dwindling savings and the occasional guilty handout from his own mother, money that eased her conscience far more than it ever eased his situation. Then came the drinking. It started small and quiet. 1 glass to take the edge off a panic attack, then 2, then the whole bottle. The first time Ethan lost control in front of his son, Milo was barely 18 months old, too young to understand a single word being screamed at him. Ethan had stood over the crib reeking of cheap liquor, sobbing about the education he'd lost, the man he'd loved, the future that had evaporated, all because of the mistake currently staring up at him with wide, uncomprehending eyes. When Ethan sobered up, the guilt hit like a truck. He dropped to his knees, clutch his toddler, weep, beg forgiveness, promise, grandly, uselessly, that he would do better, that he would be a good parent. But misery doesn't negotiate. The money ran out. The apartment got colder. The drinking got worse. The sober mornings shrank. The apologies got shorter and the cruelty got sharper, until Ethan stopped being able to look at his own son at all, because looking at Milo was like looking into a mirror that only ever showed him his own failures. The memories receded, and I was left gasping on that sticky floor, dragged back into a body that wasn't mine, in an apartment that reeked of everything I'd just relived. It was then that a flicker of motion near the hallway caught my eye. My breath caught in my throat. Standing half-hidden behind the warped frame of the bedroom door was a small boy who couldn't have been older than 3. His dark hair was matted into clumps from days without washing. He wore a shirt 3 sizes too big, hanging off shoulders that were far too thin, the fabric stained with old food and dirt. But it was his eyes that broke something loose in my chest, enormous, glassy, and filled with a fear so complete, It looked almost like a permanent feature of his face. He was pressed so hard against the wall that he seemed to be trying to disappear into it. The instant our eyes met, he flinched and scrambled backward, vanishing almost entirely behind the doorframe. A sob tore out of me before I could stop it. Tears that belonged to both Ethan's chemical guilt and my own fresh horror running down my face together. No child should have to look at their own parent the way you'd look at something dangerous. I, the man who had spent an entire adult lifetime mourning the affection he never got, suddenly felt like the most fortunate person alive compared to the small, hiding shape in that doorway. Hearing me cry, the boy didn't retreat further. Instead, his head peeked back out, and his expression wasn't relief, it was guilt. At 3 years old, Milo had already learned to believe that other people's tears were his fault, that his existence alone was enough to make his mother cry. I wiped my face and forced warmth into my voice, though it came out shaking. "Milo," I breathed, the name feeling sacred in my mouth for the first time. "Come here, baby." What happened next devastated me. He didn't run to me. He walked, slow, stiff, mechanical steps, his bare feet clicking against the filthy floor, obeying not out of love but out of a survival instinct that told him compliance was the safest option available. He stopped exactly 2 feet away, spine straight, small fists clenched at his sides, his lower lip trembling with tears he had clearly been trained not to let fall. My heart broke into pieces I didn't know it had. I crossed the last of the distance on my knees, slowly so as not to spook him, and when he didn't pull back, I gathered his small, too light frame into my arms and pressed a kiss to his dirty forehead. "I'm so sorry, baby," I whispered into his hair, my voice cracking under the weight of 2 lifetimes of sorrow at once. "Mommy is so sorry." He stayed rigid against me, arms pinned awkwardly between our chests, unsure what to do with an apology from the person he'd learned to fear most. When I pulled back to look at him, I asked gently, "Are you hungry, Milo? Do you want something to eat?" He shook his head instantly, even as his stomach growled loud enough to fill the silent room. He was starving and denying it anyway. "Do you want a warm bath?" Another shake of the head. "New clothes?" Another. "A toy to play with?" For the 4th time, he shook his head, eyes wide with a silent plea for me to stop asking. He was terrified of being a burden. He had learned, brutally and early, that wanting things, needing things, existing with demands at all, got you screamed at. It was then I noticed something else that turned my stomach. He wasn't talking. A 3-year-old should be babbling constantly, asking 100 questions an hour, whining, negotiating, existing loudly. Milo had shut his voice down entirely and retreated somewhere silence could protect him. "Okay," I said, keeping my smile steady through sheer willpower. "Okay, sweetheart, just wait right here for me." I stood, and the pounding hangover faded into total irrelevance beneath a sudden ferocious sense of purpose. I was not spending 1 more minute in this filth, and Milo wasn't breathing it in for 1 more second either. I stripped off my shirt, found a heavy-duty trash bag under the sink, and got to work. For 2 straight hours I didn't stop moving. Milo stayed exactly where I'd left him, a silent little sentry tracking my every move with those enormous eyes as I hauled out mountains of bottles, rotting containers, and garbage that had clearly been accumulating for months. I scrubbed every sticky surface, bagged the ruined blankets, and cracked the window to air the place out. The apartment was still old, peeling wallpaper, warped floorboards, but by the time I finished, it was breathable. It felt, for the first time in who knows how long, like a place a person could actually live. Next came the bathroom. I ran the tap until the water turned warm, filled the tub, and knelt in front of him. "Bath time, Milo." He let me lift him without a word. He was frighteningly light, his little bones far too visible beneath his skin. He flinched as I lowered him into the water, but the moment the warmth hit his chilled skin, a tiny involuntary sigh slipped out of him. I worked as gently as I knew how, washing days of grime from his skin and hair, massaging his scalp until his eyelids started to droop from the sheer relief of it. I wrapped him in the only clean towel I could find, dressed him in soft, laundered clothes, then took the fastest shower of my life to scrub Ethan's chaos off my own skin. When I came out, I marched straight to the kitchen, and my stomach dropped. The cabinets held exactly 1 stale box of crackers and a crushed pack of instant noodles. Unacceptable. I was not feeding a malnourished toddler processed sodium and calling it dinner. I dug out Ethan's cracked phone and pulled up the banking app. The balance staring back at me was almost a joke, barely enough to survive a few more days. but my old corporate instincts, forged over a lifetime of high-stakes strategy, refused to panic. A little capital and 48 hours was all I needed to turn this around. Tonight, though, we could afford one real meal and 2 days of groceries. That would be the bridge. I walked back out to find Milo sitting neatly on the newly scrubbed floor, looking impossibly small and impossibly sweet in his clean clothes. "Milo, we're going to go get something really good to eat, okay? Okay?" he said flatly, watching me with an expression caught somewhere between confusion and exhaustion, far too old for his face. We were nearly out the door when the second wave of memory hit me, and it hit like a freight train. I saw it, Ethan, 6 months earlier, standing outside the gates of a state orphanage, with Milo's small hand in his, convinced for one desperate moment that an institution could give the boy a better life than he could. Convinced that at least there, Milo would be fed. I felt the hollow ache of Ethan walking away from those gates, leaving his son alone on the front steps. But the resolve had cracked within the hour. Ethan had crept back to watch from behind a hedge. Milo hadn't moved an inch from the step where he'd been left. He hadn't spoken to the social workers who tried to coax him inside. He hadn't even cried, just sat there with his head down, staring at his own shoes, waiting for the world to finish abandoning him. The moment Milo spotted Ethan emerging from the bushes, he'd exploded into sobs and sprinted across the gravel to throw himself at his mother's legs. Ethan had scooped him up, his own vision blurred with tears, and screamed at his toddler through the sobbing. "You stupid child, you'd have a better life in there, you'd get real meals. Why do you want to stay with trash like me?" Milo had only clung tighter, offering nothing back but silent, desperate crying. Ethan had taken him home in the end, because in the wreckage of both their lives, they were the only two survivors left. Standing in this doorway with a very different Milo's hand in mine, the horror of what I'd just set in motion crashed over me. The bath, the clean clothes, the clean apartment, the sudden announcement that we were going out to eat something really good. To a traumatized 3-year-old, none of that read as a treat. It read as the exact blueprint of his abandonment. Milo believed I had cleaned him up to make him presentable for an institution, and that this meal was a farewell dinner. "Oh, sweetheart, no." The words tore out of me. I dropped immediately to my knees and pulled his rigid little body against my chest, wrapping my arms around him like a wall between him and the world. "Milo, listen to Mommy's voice. Look at me, baby." He refused to let go, burying his wet face into the crook of my neck, his whole body shaking with silent, hiccuping sobs. "I am never leaving you," I said, over and over, like a vow sworn to the universe itself. "I promise, Milo, I will never, ever leave you again. You and Mommy are going to live together forever. You're going to have warm food every single day, and I'm going to buy you so many toys you won't know what to do with them all. I promise, baby, I promise." He didn't answer with words, but as I kept repeating the promise, rocking him gently, the shaking in his small frame slowly began to ease. His panicked breathing settled into quiet, exhausted exhales against my neck. He didn't loosen his grip on my shirt, though. His fingers stayed locked in the fabric like a lifeline, as if letting go for even a second might make the whole world dissolve. Getting him into a booth at the family restaurant down the street proved to be its own small battle. His fingers tightened with a spike of panic the moment I tried to set him down, so I simply kept him on my lap instead. He faced the table but refused to lean back, keeping his spine pressed to my chest, one small fist still twisted into my shirt. When the food arrived, a plate of rice, tender shredded chicken, mild broth, Milo went completely still, staring at it with the unblinking intensity of someone examining an alien artifact. At 3 years old, he had lived on stale crackers and scraps. A hot meal on a clean plate was a concept his body didn't know how to process. "Let's eat, baby." I picked up the spoon, blew on a bite until it was just right, and guided it to his lips. "Open up for Mommy." His eyes darted from the spoon to my face, searching for the trap. Finding none, he parted his lips and let me feed him. The moment the flavor hit his tongue, his eyes went wide with something close to wonder, and his little jaw started working with sudden, ravenous enthusiasm. Watching his cheeks fill out as he chewed was, without exaggeration, the single most beautiful thing I had witnessed across 2 lifetimes. I fed him spoon after spoon until color came back into his face, and he finally patted his own stomach and leaned back against me with a small, satisfied sigh. On the walk home, hand wrapped fully around 2 of my fingers in an iron grip, we passed the glowing window of a toy shop, plush bears, toy trains, glittering blocks. I slowed on purpose, waiting to see if his eyes would light up. They didn't. He didn't even turn his head. He had been so thoroughly taught that joy was for other people that his brain had simply stopped registering toy shops as something that applied to him. To hell with the budget, I thought, fury rising against a past that wasn't even mine to be angry about. I had turned a failing startup into a billion-dollar company in another life through sheer stubbornness. I could make a few $100s stretch. This kid was getting a toy today, even if it meant skipping a meal myself. I steered us inside. The bell over the door chimed. I knelt beside him in front of a wall of soft stuffed animals. "Do you see anything you like? Pick one for yourself." He stiffened immediately, eyes darting around the bright room before dropping to his own shoes, and tried to tug me back toward the exit. "Hey," I said gently, catching his chin. "Look at that big brown puppy up there. Doesn't he look lonely? I think he needs a good boy like you to look after him. Can we take him home?" Milo blinked and glanced hesitantly at the plush dog. He didn't say anything, but his fingers twitched. I didn't give him the chance to talk himself out of it. I grabbed the toy, paid, and pressed it into his arms before he could protest. He froze, holding it like it might shatter. Then, slowly, his arms wrapped fully around it, his face burying into the fake fur. He didn't let go for the rest of the night. By the time we stopped at a small market for 2 days of groceries, eggs, milk, bread, a few vegetables, the day had finally caught up with him. On the last stretch home, Milo was practically sleepwalking, his stuffed puppy dragging along the pavement. I shifted the grocery bag to one arm and lifted him onto my hip with the other. The second his feet left the ground, his head dropped onto my shoulder and he was out, his grip on the puppy tightening even as he fell asleep mid-motion. I carried him upstairs, laid him in the center of the clean bed, and went to put together a simple dinner for later. An hour later, as the sky outside turned deep indigo, I heard the rustle of sheets. A small, sleep-rumpled figure appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair wild, eyes half shut, one hand still clutching the puppy by its ear. He blinked against the light, spotted me at the stove, and crossed the room without a sound to wrap both arms around my leg, attaching himself to me like a small, determined koala. I laughed softly. After everything this body had done to him, the screaming, the neglect, the alcohol, this small, precious creature still loved his mother without condition. The original Ethan had been handed something like a miracle and had chosen, again and again, to crush it. I turned off the burner and scooped him up. "Dinner's almost ready, big guy." He nodded against my jaw, thumb tucked into his mouth. It hurt me that he was still so quiet. A child who had shut down his own voice was a child whose sense of safety had been gutted at the root. I needed him talking again, whining, demanding things, acting like an ordinary, chaotic 3-year-old. I set 2 plates on the little kitchen table, scrambled eggs and soft bread for him, the same for me, and sat him beside me. He sat perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, staring at the steam without touching his fork. "What's wrong, baby?" A spark of anxiety hit me. "Don't you like it?" He shook his head. "No, that wasn't it. Does your tummy hurt?" Another shake. He went right back to staring at the plate, brow furrowed in silent concentration. I watched him a long moment before it clicked. "Milo," I said, leaning in with a teasing whisper, "is it too hot? Do you want mommy to feed you?" His head shot up and he began nodding with sudden, frantic enthusiasm, shoulders bouncing with the motion, a deep blush crawling up his neck and across his cheeks at the sheer audacity of wanting to be babied. It was so unbearably endearing that I genuinely considered suing whoever wrote this child into a villain. How dare they take this soft, blushing, precious little person and turn him into a cold-blooded antagonist on paper? I fed him bite by bite for the next 20 minutes, fawning over every chew until his plate was spotless. That night I made 2 neat little beds out of the salvaged linens, giving him his own space, then lay beside him telling soft, made-up stories about dragons and kingdoms until his breathing deepened into sleep. Once I was sure he was out cold, I rolled to my own side of the bed and let exhaustion finally take me too. A few hours later, in the dead of night, a faint scratching sound woke me. Old instincts, the kind honed by years of high-stakes negotiations where the smallest shift in a room meant something, had my eyes open instantly. I reached over to check on Milo. The spot beside me was empty. Panic detonated in my chest. I bolted upright, scanning the dark. "Milo," I whispered, voice shaking. A faint rustle answered from the far corner of the room. I swung my legs out of bed and followed the sound to the old wooden wardrobe where a handful of Ethan's clothes still hung. The door was cracked open. I reached for the handle and pulled it wide. My breath caught. Curled into a tight ball on the closet floor, buried under a pile of discarded, unwashed sweaters, was Milo, fast asleep, a fistful of knitted cardigan clutched in one hand. His nose pressed into the fabric. The whole wardrobe smelled faintly of Ethan's own scent, the biological signature of an omega parent that, despite everything, still represented safety and comfort to a pup's instincts. The clothes bore the worn imprint of a body that had curled there many, many times before. He'd been sneaking into this dark, cramped hiding place for who knows how long, chasing the comfort of his mother's scent because he wasn't allowed to ask for it while awake. It had become an unconscious habit, a coping mechanism built by a child with no other options. A lump rose in my throat. I knelt down, slid my arms under his small body, and lifted him out along with the scent-soaked sweater he refused to release. I carried him back to bed, but this time I didn't lay him on his own side. I lay flat on my back and pulled him onto my chest instead. He stirred, nuzzling automatically into my neck, small hands anchoring into my shirt as he let out a long, shuddering sigh of relief. When morning light broke through the window, he was still exactly where I'd placed him, cheek pressed to my chest, legs tangled with mine, dead to the world. The warmth of it, the sheer unguarded trust in it, sent something powerful moving through my chest. Whatever I had to do, whoever I had to become, I was never letting this apartment, this fear, this silence happen to him again. Somewhere underneath that resolve, I felt something else too, faint, almost imperceptible, like a second heartbeat that wasn't quite mine, a flicker of grief that didn't belong to me, watching through my eyes as Milo slept peacefully, for what might have been the first time in his life. I didn't understand it yet. I filed it away and let it go, too exhausted to chase a feeling I couldn't name. Once Milo was fed, bathed, and finally sleeping without needing to hide in a closet to do it, my corporate brain, the one part of me that had survived death completely intact, kicked into gear. I didn't have the luxury of easing into this new life. I knew exactly how this story unfolded, because I'd read it, cover to cover, more times than I wanted to admit. I knew that Julian's family, the very people who had thrown Ethan away like garbage, were about to lose everything in a corporate war against a man named Damian Kane, a ruthless, ice-cold alpha CEO who, in the novel, would spend the next several years quietly annihilating Julian's family empire out of a grudge so old and personal that even the author never fully explained its origin. I knew that within 18 months, Damian would enter a loveless, arranged marriage to a woman from another prominent family, a marriage that would collapse in a bitter divorce when she fled the country pregnant, hiding their son, a boy named Caleb, the actual protagonist of the novel, from him for 17 years. None of that mattered to me right now. What mattered was this: Damian Kane was currently single, terrifyingly powerful, held a personal vendetta against Julian's family, and I happened to be sitting on a mountain of future knowledge that could hand him the exact leverage he'd otherwise spend years hunting for. I walked into the marble lobby of Kane Holdings, holding Milo's hand, and marched straight to the reception desk to request an immediate meeting with the CEO. The receptionist took one look at my worn clothes and lack of any visible credentials, and did not bother hiding her skepticism. I didn't flinch. I used the flat, precise corporate tone I had spent a lifetime perfecting, and told her I had information about a critical security leak connected to the upcoming Whitfield Group acquisition. Information the CEO needed to hear today, not next week. We were told to wait. For the next 90 minutes, I sat on a leather couch in that lobby, with Milo perfectly still beside me, his stuffed puppy clutched in both hands, his enormous eyes tracking the grandeur of the space without a single complaint. No whining, no fidgeting. He was operating like a soldier on a secret mission, determined to be good enough that his mother wouldn't leave him behind here too. Eventually, an assistant came down to inform me the CEO would give me exactly 5 minutes. I rode the elevator up, stopped outside a set of heavy mahogany doors, and knelt in front of Milo. Milo, Mommy has to go talk to someone for a few minutes. I need you to sit right here in this chair and hold your puppy and be my big brave boy. Can you do that? He looked at the door, then back at me, and nodded with a gravity far too serious for a 3-year-old, climbing onto the leather chair and hugging the puppy to his chest like a shield. I took a breath and pushed the door open. Damian Kane was seated behind a wide glass desk, and no description in any novel could have prepared me for him in person. He was sharp-featured, dark-eyed, radiating the kind of cold, magnetic authority that could suffocate a lesser Omega on instinct alone. The scent rolling off him, cedar, cold air, something like the edge of a storm, hit me before I'd even crossed the room. He didn't look up from his tablet. "You have 4 minutes." His voice was deep, smooth, and entirely without warmth. "What does one of Julian Cross's leftovers want with me? If you're here hoping a sad story and a pretty face buys you a handout from this company, turn around now." I didn't flinch. I walked straight to the chair across from his desk and sat, crossing my legs with an ease that clearly threw him off balance. His eyes finally lifted, one brow arching as he took in my posture. "I'm not here for a handout, Mr. Kane," I said, voice level and entirely professional. "I'm here to offer you a business deal." A cold, amused smirk touched his mouth. "A deal? And what exactly could an unemployed, college dropout Omega offer this company?" "The identity of the mole in your executive office," I said instantly. "The one you've been quietly hunting for 3 months. The one feeding your proprietary data straight to Julian's firm." The amusement vanished from his face like it had never existed. The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees as his aura flared, testing me. "Why should I believe a single word out of your mouth?" "Because," I said, glancing at the watch on his wrist, "in exactly 2 minutes, your senior VP of acquisitions is going to walk through that door to tell you the Whitfield deal just collapsed. And it collapsed because Julian's firm somehow had your exact confidential bidding number, down to the dollar. Information leaked by your mole." The silence that followed was absolute. Damian stared at me, searching for a crack in my expression, a flicker of a bluff. Before he could respond, the door burst open and his assistant rushed in, pale-faced. "Mr. Kane, I'm so sorry, but Whitfield just pulled out. Julian's firm outbid us by a fraction of a %. I offered a small, calm smile and leaned back in my chair. "So, Mr. Kane, do we have enough common ground to talk now?" He waved the assistant out. The door clicked shut. He leaned forward, chin resting on steepled fingers, eyes burning with dangerous curiosity. "Who is it?" "My terms first," I said. "A significant advance deposited into my account by tonight, and I want the position of your executive personal assistant." A low, dark laugh. "The money is trivial." "The assistant position?" "Absolutely not. That role requires elite strategy and total command of my schedule. My current assistant has been with me 6 years. I don't replace 6 years of loyalty with an untested stranger." "Your 6 years of loyalty is the mole," I said calmly, watching the shock freeze his features. "Bought out by Julian's father 18 months ago to cover gambling debts. Run a quiet audit on his offshore accounts today, and you'll have proof by nightfall. He can be replaced. He will be." Damian rose, circling the desk to stand a foot from my chair, the cedar and storm scent deepening around me. "You are remarkably bold, Ethan. What's stopping me from taking this information and throwing you out of this building without paying you a dime?" I stood to meet him eye to eye, refusing to be intimidated by the height difference. "Because no matter how ruthless this city thinks you are, I know you're a man of principle. And more importantly, this mole is only the surface. I have information that can dismantle Julian's entire empire down to the foundation. You want those cards, Mr. Kane, which means you want me on your side of the table." A slow, genuine smirk broke across his face, the first real crack in the ice I'd seen all day. "Go home, Ethan. Wait for my call." That night, curled up on the clean bed, feeding Milo warm soup, my phone buzzed with a deposit notification that made my stomach flip. A second later it rang. "The intel was flawless," Damian's voice said, dark amusement coiling through it. "My former assistant is currently being escorted out by security. You start tomorrow at 8 sharp. I'll need 10 days, Mr. Kane," I said smoothly. "I have to find a proper apartment and enroll my son in a decent daycare. Motherhood requires logistics." A pause, then a low chuckle that sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. 10 days it is. Don't be late." The following week and a half was a whirlwind of transformation. With Damian's advance, I moved us out of that reeking apartment and into a bright, sunlit unit in a secure, quiet neighborhood. Big windows, a modern kitchen, and a real bedroom just for Milo. The change in him was profound. Once the apartment stopped smelling like alcohol and rot, once he was fed on a schedule and praised constantly instead of screamed at, his walls started coming down brick by brick. He stopped sneaking into closets to sleep. He started stringing together words, then rare, whole sentences. One afternoon, while I stood at the stove flipping pancakes, I felt a small tug at my sweatpants. I looked down. Milo stood there, eyes bright with a mix of pride and nerves, holding up a large sheet of drawing paper. I knelt immediately and took it from him. It was a crayon drawing, two stick figures holding hands under a giant yellow sun. One was tall with long hair, the other was small, clutching a brown blob unmistakably meant to be his stuffed puppy. "Milo," I breathed, eyes already stinging. "Did you draw this for Mommy?" He nodded, a proud smile breaking across his face, and pointed to the taller figure. "This is Mommy," then to the smaller one, "and this is Milo, happy." A tear splashed onto the paper before I even felt it fall. I pulled him into my arms and kissed him until he let out a small, delighted giggle. He kept changing, in the softest ways. He tried, clumsily, to help around the house, carrying a small plastic cup he could barely hold, attempting to wash it in the sink, then spinning around with total seriousness. "Mommy, look, Milo is a big boy." "Milo helps Mommy." I fawned over every attempt until he glowed with pride. We started going to the park every evening, and eventually his laughter filled the air like it had never been missing. On my first official day at Kane Holdings, reality delivered its first real snag. I'd enrolled Milo in a secure daycare a few blocks from the office. Leaving him there turned out to be a psychological gauntlet I was not remotely prepared for. When the daycare worker gently led him into the playroom, Milo didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't throw a fit. He simply walked in, head straight, refusing to look back at me through the glass. It gutted me. Watching him walk away that calmly was somehow worse than any tantrum could have been. My first day at the office was, predictably, a disaster of distraction. The man who had once managed billion-dollar portfolios with mathematical precision couldn't stop staring at the clock. I botched simple data entry, misfiled a schedule, and checked my phone every 5 minutes. By hour 4, Damien had clearly reached his limit. He walked out of his office and stood in front of my desk, blocking the light with his frame. "Ethan," he said, voice carrying a strange, low warning. "You've typed the same sentence for the last 4 hours and you're radiating enough panic to set off a fire alarm. Go get your son. Fix your head. I expect actual competence tomorrow." I didn't argue. I grabbed my coat and half-ran the entire way to the daycare, heart pounding, with the irrational fear that Milo was sitting alone somewhere crying. When the director walked me to the observation window, I froze. He was sitting cross-legged on a rug, calmly stacking blocks with a group of other kids. Fine, cooperative, completely fine. I let out a long breath, feeling ridiculous for having overreacted. Then the worker opened the door and called out, "Milo, look who's here." His head snapped toward the door, and the calm expression shattered instantly. His face crumpled, and he was sprinting across the room before I could blink, arms flung out in front of him. "Mommy, Mommy." I dropped to my knees and caught him as he crashed into my arms, holding on so hard it nearly knocked me over. I lifted him up, his legs locking around my waist, his face buried in my neck, and felt the tears he'd been holding all day finally soak into my collar. "Did you miss Mommy?" I choked out, my own eyes stinging. He nodded frantically against my neck. "Milo missed Mommy a lot. Mommy missed you even more, baby." From that day forward, we built a new routine. On light schedule days, he went to daycare. On the long, brutal ones, I brought him straight to the executive floor with me. Damien resisted the arrangement at first, radiating cold, professional disapproval, until I proved, repeatedly, that I could run circles around his previous assistant while also raising a toddler without dropping a single ball. I used a lifetime of financial instinct and every scrap of future knowledge I possessed to streamline his acquisitions with a precision that left the entire board quietly stunned. And then, without either of us quite planning it, something unexpected began to bloom in that office. On afternoons when I was drowning in audits, Damien would step out from behind his glass desk, lower himself onto the rug beside Milo, and get pulled into an extremely serious game of building blocks or toy race cars, the most terrifying alpha in the city, cross-legged on the floor, negotiating track rules with a 3-year-old. It was, objectively, ridiculous. It was also the first time I let myself believe this new life might actually turn into something good. One evening, running late on a due diligence report, I looked up from my desk to find the two of them missing entirely. I found them in the small conference room down the hall, blinds drawn, lights dimmed. Damien sat on the floor with his back against the wall, Milo tucked against his side, both of them staring up at the ceiling where Damien had somehow rigged a makeshift projector to throw a wobbly, hand-drawn constellation across the tiles. "That one's the brave knight," Damien was saying, low and serious, pointing at a cluster of dots that looked, to my eye, like nothing in particular. "He guards the whole sky at night so nobody's scared of the dark." "Is he scared of anything?" Milo asked. "No," Damien said. "Because he knows exactly who he's protecting, and that makes him braver than anyone." I stood in the doorway a long moment, unnoticed, watching the most feared executive in the city build a bedtime story out of nothing for a boy who used to sleep in a closet. I didn't say anything. I just quietly closed the door and let them have it. Months passed. Somewhere in the middle of late nights spent reviewing contracts and evenings, spent watching Damien carry Milo around on his shoulders, I stopped being able to pretend I didn't feel something for him. It came to a head on a night I hadn't planned for. I'd just closed a brutal negotiation that had cost Julian's father another major contract, and instead of feeling triumphant, I'd found myself standing at the office window afterward, unexpectedly hollow, thinking about everything Ethan had lost and everything I had almost let happen to Milo before I ever opened my eyes in this world. Damien found me there. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside me. Close enough that his warmth reached me before his voice did. "You're thinking about him again," he said. Not a question. "I keep thinking about how close I came to losing him before I even knew him," I admitted quietly. "How easily this could have gone differently, it didn't." His voice was steady, low. "You didn't let it, I know. My voice caught, and to my own embarrassment, my eyes started burning. He turned to face me fully, and whatever had been holding us at arm's length for months simply gave out. The distance between us disappeared. I don't know which of us moved first, but a heartbeat later his mouth was on mine. Not a mistake, not an accident, but something deliberate and certain. It started as comfort, and turned quickly into something far more consuming. A soft gasp escaped me against his lips, and he took full advantage of it, one hand curling around the back of my neck, the other pulling me flush against him, lifting me slightly off the floor, as though he needed me anchored entirely to him. When he finally pulled back, just barely, his breathing was ragged, and his eyes were dark with something unmistakable. He pressed his forehead to mine, thumbs brushing my cheeks. "Ethan," he said, voice thick, "let me be a permanent part of your life, and his. I love you. And I love that boy like he's already my own son. I swear on everything I have, I will never let anyone hurt either of you again." Warmth bloomed through my chest, dissolving the last cold remnants of a past life that had never known anything like this. "I love you too, Damien," I whispered honestly, "but we can't marry yet. I need Milo to get used to this, to you being a constant, permanent part of our lives. If it doesn't sit right with him, I'll choose his comfort over my own heart every single time." He kissed the tip of my nose, smiling. "I'd expect nothing less from you. I'll wait as long as it takes." Predictably, Milo did not take the shared attention well. His old insecurities flared instantly, and he turned himself into a small, determined human wall between Damien and me. Whenever we sat together to review documents, he'd march over, plant himself in the narrow gap between us, and refuse to budge. He flatly banned Damien from the bed. Whenever Damien stayed late, Milo would station himself at the foot of the mattress, puppy clutched like a shield, voice dead serious. "Only Milo sleeps in Mommy's bed. Damien has his own house." Damien never fought it, though his face would twist into a comically wounded expression every time he was exiled to the guest room. We took to sneaking quiet moments in the living room after Milo was asleep, and during the day, when he was safely at daycare, Damien would abuse his executive authority to summon me into his office under the guise of an urgent crisis, only to pull me onto his lap and complain at length about how much he hated even an hour apart from me. But over the following months, patiently, Milo's walls came down the same way mine had. Damien built blanket forts that took up half the living room. He told long, dramatic stories about knights and dragons until Milo sat rapt. He bought him a set of toy guns and carried him on his shoulders at the park, running elaborate defend-the-fort missions. Slowly, Milo stopped seeing him as competition and started seeing him as a hero. When we finally decided it was time to get married, we sat Milo down to tell him, first. It did not go smoothly. His face crumpled instantly, and he burst into tears, stomping his feet. No, Milo wants to marry Mommy. I don't want Damien to marry Mommy." "I'm gonna marry Mommy." Damien handled it with a level of tactical genius I still think about. He knelt down to Milo's eye level, deadly serious. Milo, listen, look how tall Mommy is. If you want to marry Mommy, you have to grow taller than him first, so you can protect him from the bad guys, right? Milo stopped crying mid-sob, blinking through his tears as he processed this. Taller? Exactly, Damien said, straight-faced. You can marry Mommy the second you're taller than him. But until then, somebody has to handle protection duty. So let me marry Mommy temporarily, just to cover the mission. The moment you're bigger, you take over. Deal? Milo looked at Damien, then up at my height, clearly recalculating his entire strategy. He wiped his nose on his sleeve and stuck out his hand. Deal. Milo will grow very fast. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing at the sheer absurdity and beauty of that negotiation. Shortly after, I met Damien's parents, who turned out to be warm, easy people who welcomed both of us without a second of hesitation, even as Damien hovered over us the entire dinner like a bodyguard who had personally appointed himself. His mother pulled me aside in the kitchen at one point, pressing a cup of tea into my hands. He's never brought anyone home before, she said quietly, watching her son through the doorway as he patiently helped Milo build a fortress out of dinner rolls. Not once. I want you to know that whatever you did to soften him like this, I hope you never stop doing it. I didn't have a good answer for that either. I just watched Damien laugh, actually laugh, unguarded, at something ridiculous Milo said, and thought that maybe I hadn't done anything to him at all. Maybe he'd just been waiting, the same way Milo had been waiting, for someone to finally show up and stay. The universe, however, wasn't finished with us yet. Every part of me that had once run a company for a living knew better than to relax just because the hardest chapters seemed to be behind us. Somewhere out there, Julian's family was still watching, still furious, and still one bad decision away from doing something we couldn't undo. Julian's family empire had been dismantled piece by piece over the past year, our joint corporate warfare stripping them down to almost nothing. Desperate and furious, Julian eventually discovered the truth about Damien and me, and our upcoming wedding. One afternoon, I arrived at the daycare to pick up Milo and found the whole facility on high alert. Julian was standing in the lobby, wild-eyed, screaming at the staff that he was the biological father and had every right to see his son. They'd locked Milo in the back office for safety and called me immediately. I called Damien, who insisted on meeting me there. Julian spun around the second we walked in. Despite his ruined finances, his face twisted into the same smug arrogance he'd worn years ago, as if some part of him still believed he held power over Ethan. He looked Damien dead in the eye. Well, the great CEO really does enjoy playing with my leftovers, doesn't he? That Omega used to beg at my feet. He didn't finish the sentence. Damien closed the distance between them before I could even react, and a single sharp punch to the jaw sent Julian stumbling back into the wall. He slid down to the floor, one hand clutching his split lip, the arrogance finally draining out of his face and leaving only fear behind. Damien stepped over him, voice ice-cold. If you ever breathe the same air as my family again, I won't just ruin what's left of your company. I'll make sure you disappear from this city entirely. Now get out before I forget there are children in this building. Julian scrambled up, wiped the blood off his lip, and fled through the exit, throwing a shaky, useless threat over his shoulder that this wasn't over. The real final boss showed up 2 days later. Damien had been called into an emergency filing at the office, leaving me and Milo alone in our new apartment. The doorbell rang sharply. I opened it to find Julian's parents standing on the threshold, flanked by a corporate lawyer holding a thick stack of documents. They pushed past me into the living room without waiting for an invitation, voices dripping with old money entitlement. "We have rights," Julian's mother snapped, gesturing wildly with her designer bag. "That child upstairs carries our bloodline, and that counts for something. We're here to legally claim our grandson. A child of our blood will not be raised by a trashy Omega and a rival firm's CEO. We will take him by force if we have to." The shouting brought the bedroom door flying open upstairs. Milo came marching down the staircase, face set in an expression of pure, ferocious determination, wielding his plastic toy gun with both hands, aimed squarely at the 2 elderly intruders as he planted himself in front of me like a shield. "Don't hurt my mommy," he shouted, voice trembling but fierce. "Get away from my mommy, you evil monsters. Milo will shoot you." A wave of love and pride hit me so hard it nearly buckled my knees. I knelt down, gently took the toy from his hands, and kissed his cheek. Thank you for protecting Mommy, my brave boy. You did an amazing job. Now go back upstairs and let the grown-ups talk. Mommy is completely safe, I promise. He gave the couple one last sharp nod, then marched back up the stairs like a soldier following orders. Julian's father let out a cold, disgusted scoff, watching him go. So that's the boy. Clearly our bloodline, but that behavior is uncivilized. He'll need serious institutional discipline. Our family's heir cannot act like a street rat. Something in me went perfectly, dangerously calm. The old corporate strategist, the one who had built and buried empires in a past life, woke up completely. I stood to my full height and looked down at them with a cold, level smile. Do you really want to play this game with me? My voice was quiet and even, and it landed like a threat because it was one. If you so much as dream about laying a hand on my son, I will hand a very specific piece of documentation to the international press tomorrow morning. One that will permanently obliterate your family name, your legacy, and whatever's left of your business holdings. The color drained from both their faces. What are you talking about? Julian's mother stammered. The Cross Foundation patent, I said, slow and precise. The one your family registered under Julian's grandfather's name 40 years ago. The exact patent that built your entire dynasty. Would the world be interested to learn that your husband stole that patent from a struggling independent scientist and then framed him for fraud to keep him quiet? I let that sit. I have the digital trail, the original blueprints, the testimonies. This was the exact card the novel's original hero had used, years later, to destroy Milo's holdings for good. I was simply cashing it in early, using the same weapon to protect the child instead of ending him. You're bluffing, Julian's father shrieked, his composure finally cracking. The apartment door opened again. Damien walked in, calm as still water, a thick leather folder in one hand. He crossed to the coffee table and dropped it directly in front of their trembling fingers. Here's your proof, he said, voice carrying absolute finality, as he wrapped an arm around my waist and pulled me against him. Now, if either of you comes within a mile of my family, my spouse, or my son again, I will personally see to it that your entire name is erased from this city's history. Take your paperwork and get out of my home. They stared at the folder for a long, silent second before the reality of total defeat set in. They grabbed their lawyer and fled without another word, never to return. 3 weeks before the wedding, something happened that I hadn't planned for and couldn't have predicted. Even with a full memory of the novel's plot, Felix showed up at the office. I recognized him instantly. The original novel's golden omega lead, soft-spoken and luminous exactly the way the book described him, standing awkwardly near the reception desk in a coat that looked too warm for the season. In the story, Felix and Milo had never crossed paths this early. By this point in the original timeline, Milo hadn't even met him yet. His presence here, now, was something entirely outside the plot I knew. I'm sorry to just show up like this, he said when I came out to meet him, twisting his hands together. I heard, around town, people talk that Julian Cross's ex is engaged to Damien Kane, and that there's a little boy involved. I wanted to see if it was who I thought it was. My stomach dropped somewhere near my shoes. You know Julian? I used to, Felix said, something bitter flickering behind the words. Before he left the country the first time. Before I found out what he'd done to you, to both of you. I didn't know until much later. If I'd known sooner, I would have. He stopped himself, shook his head. It doesn't matter now. I just wanted to see him, Milo, if that's all right. I studied him for a long moment, running the entire novel back through my head, hunting for the version of Felix who was supposed to exist. Soft, tragic, endlessly patient, with a version of Milo who never got the chance to be anything but broken. This Felix, standing in front of me with guilt written plainly across his face, wasn't a character in a book any more than I was. He was just a person who had once, in another version of events, loved a boy the world had already given up on, and lost him to a cruelty neither of them had chosen. I brought him to the daycare that afternoon. Milo, 4 years old and thoroughly unbothered by strangers now that he had a mother, a soon-to-be father, and an entire fortress of confidence built around him, looked Felix over with polite curiosity. "Hi," Felix said, crouching down to his level, voice gentle. "I'm a friend of your mommy's. Well, I hope I could be someday." Milo considered this with the seriousness of a tiny CEO reviewing a contract. "Do you like puppies?" "I love puppies." "Okay," Milo said, apparently satisfied, and held up his stuffed dog for inspection. "This is my puppy. His name is Biscuit." Watching the two of them, The boy who in another life had destroyed this very man out of desperation and fear, and the man who in that same life had walked away and let him be destroyed for it. I understood finally what the twist in this story actually was. It wasn't that Milo had been saved from becoming a villain. It was that Felix had been saved too, from ever having to be someone's tragedy, from ever having to watch someone he might have loved get torn apart by people who never once tried to help him first. Neither of them owed the other anything. But as I watched Felix ruffle Milo's hair and Milo demand, with total confidence, that Felix admire his block tower, I let myself believe that maybe, in this rewritten version of events, they'd simply get to be friends. Nothing tragic required. Felix caught my eye over Milo's head and gave me a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not letting the story happen the way it was supposed to. I didn't have a clean answer for that. I just nodded." Watching my son laugh at something Felix said, and thought, neither did I know it could be rewritten. I just refused to let it stay the same. Our wedding took place a month later in a sunlit botanical garden. It was small, elegant, and warm in every way that mattered. When the music started, it wasn't a traditional usher who walked me down the aisle. It was Milo, 4 years old now, dressed in a tiny custom black tuxedo, hair combed neatly, face glowing with a pride so radiant it nearly outshone the sun. His small hand held mine the entire way, guiding me steadily toward Damien, who stood waiting at the altar like he couldn't believe his own luck. When it came time for vows, Damien looked into my eyes, but reached down to rest his other hand gently on Milo's head at the same time. "I take you, Ethan, as my spouse," he said, "and I take you, Milo, as my son. I swear to honor and protect you both for the rest of my life," I cried. Not out of grief, not out of exhaustion, but out of a happiness so complete it washed away every last trace of the emptiness I had died with in another lifetime. A year later, our lives changed shape again. I'm currently 6 months pregnant with our second child, and Damien has developed a level of hovering, borderline comical protectiveness that I've stopped trying to talk him out of. But nobody guards me more fiercely than Milo. The boy who once refused to ask for a single cracker for fear of being a burden has become the most dedicated, self-important big brother in recorded history. Every couple of days he tugs on my coat and insists, with total seriousness, that we need to go to the toy store because the baby needs a specific bear. He spends long stretches talking directly to my stomach, promising the baby elaborate protection from every monster he can think of. A few weeks ago, the original Ethan appeared in a dream, standing in a space of soft white light, healthy, sober, at peace. He looked at me and said quietly, "Thank you. I always knew you'd take care of him. I'm sorry for what I did." When I woke up beside Damien's warm frame, with Milo curled at the foot of the bed like a small cat, I thought about that dream for a long time. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive the original Ethan. I understand, intellectually, the poverty and despair and breakdown that drove him to where he ended up. But looking at the sweet, unguarded boy sleeping beside me, I still believe no parent should ever choose their own grief over their child's safety. It doesn't matter anymore, though. That tragic novel is over. The villain never got the chance to exist. There is only Milo, our beautiful, blushing, toy-obsessed little boy, living out the happy ending nobody ever thought to write for him. Last week, he came home from his first day of preschool clutching a new drawing. Holding it up before he'd even taken off his shoes, this one had 4 stick figures under the sun instead of 2. A tall one with long hair, a taller one beside it with broad shoulders, a small one holding a toy gun, and a 4th, smaller still, drawn as a round little scribble tucked inside the tall figure's middle. "That's the new baby," Milo explained, pointing at the scribble with the seriousness of a man presenting a business plan. Milo drew the baby inside Mommy's tummy so it doesn't get lost. I pinned it to the refrigerator myself, right next to the first one he ever gave me, the one with 2 stick figures and a single word underneath it that I still can't look at without my chest going tight. Happy. Some nights, when the house is quiet and Damien is asleep with one arm thrown protectively across both me and the small, star-shaped space where our second child is due to arrive, I think about the version of this story that almost happened. The one where a broken boy grew into a broken man, loved the only way he knew how, and was destroyed for it while an entire readership cheered. I think about how close that ending came to being the only one that existed. It isn't anymore. It never will be again. There is only this, a little boy with a puppy named Biscuit, a father who builds him constellations out of nothing, and a mother who finally got the chance to get it right. We'd love to know, if you woke up inside a story you already knew the ending to, what's the first thing you'd change? Drop your answer in the comments. We genuinely read everyone. And if this kind of story hits home for you, hitting subscribe means we get to keep making more of them.